Egypt's first pyramid is the NW kid on this list. There are 8 places across Britain and Ireland that were already old, some by centuries, some by thousands of years, before a single stone went up at Saqqara around 2667 BC. Archaeologists know this from radiocarbon dates and tree rings, not guesswork or legend. Some of these places are famous enough to visit today: a stone village on an Orkney beach, a tomb capstone that looks like it is floating on a Welsh hillside. Others are stranger: a wooden path buried in a Somerset bog, a cave gallery carved by hunters chasing reindeer at the edge of the ice. Stick around for the last one, because it was already abandoned for longer than all of recorded history before Egypt built anything at all. Before any of that makes sense, it helps to fix Oni date firmly in your head. Egypt's first true pyramid was the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, built for a king named Djoser somewhere around 2667 to 2648 BC. The Great Pyramid at Giza came later still, finished around 2580 to 2560 BC. Every single place on this list gets measured against that first date, the Step Pyramid, not the more famous Giza one, so the comparisons here are the conservative version, not the exaggerated one. In the winter of 1850, a storm ripped the dunes off a beach on Orkney's Bay of Scale and exposed stone walls that hadn't seen daylight in thousands of years. The walls belonged to Skara Brae. It is a Neolithic village occupied from around 3180 BC to about 2500 BC, and it is the most complete village of its kind left standing anywhere in Europe. EIJ stone houses survive, joined by covered stone passageways and packed into an insulating mound of midden, compacted household waste in plain terms that kept the Atlantic wind out. The layout barely changes from house to house. Walk into any one and you will find a stone dresser facing the door, box beds built into the walls, storage boxes set into the floor, and a hearth in the middle of the room. Whoever lived here had roughly the same furniture as their neighbours, which suggests a settled, ordered kind of life, not a scattering of huts. Here's the honest part, because it matters. None of this is legend or reconstruction guesswork. It is excavated, dated, and displayed exactly as it was found, right down to the stone shelving, and radiocarbon dating confirms the site really is about 5,000 years old. Nowhere else in Neolithic Britain has this kind of fitted stone furniture survived, which is part of why Skara Brae now sits inside the heart of Neolithic Orkney UNESCO World Heritage Site alongside its neighbours. Do the math on that gap. By the time Djoser's workers started stacking the first tiers of the Step Pyramid, Skara Brae had already been a working village for around 500 years, with generations of the same families cooking over the same hearths. A short walk from that same beach stands a much stranger monument. The stones of Stenness were raised somewhere around 3100 to 2900 BC, and radiocarbon testing on bone from the surrounding ditchbacks that date up. Historians consider it a strong candidate for the earliest henge, meaning a circular monument set inside a ditch and bank anywhere in the British Isles, older than any other henge anyone has found so far. Only 4 of the original 12 standing stones remain today, the tallest reaching about 6 meters, arranged in an oval roughly 30 meters across. The ditch around it was cut straight into bedrock, at least 4 meters wide and 2 meters deep, which isn't a small undertaking without metal tools, since Neolithic Orkney had no bronze or iron at all. At the center of the ring sits a harch, and the pottery and animal bone dug up around it show that people cooked and ate meals there. This wasn't a silent monument nobody touched. It was a place people actually used, and a later reanalysis of the radiocarbon evidence still keeps it inside that same early window, somewhere close to 2900 BC. Stones of Stenness now shares UNESCO recognition with Skara Brae as part of the same heart of Neolithic Orkney site. The two places served completely different purposes, just a short walk apart. It was already standing for around 400 to 500 years before Djoser laid out his first stone courses at Saqqara, and from here, the story moves south, out of Scotland entirely, to a tomb in Wales built around the same centuries. It has a stone balanced on top of it that seems to defy the way stone is supposed to behave. Pentre Ifan sits on a hillside in Pembrokeshire, and it's the largest, best preserved dolmen left in Wales, dated to around 3500 BC. That date alone puts it deep in British history. A dolmen is a tomb built from a handful of massive upright stones topped with one huge capstone, and the capstone here is the whole reason people still climb this hill to see it. That capstone runs about 5 meters long, 2.5 meters wide, nearly a meter thick, and weighs somewhere close to 16 tons. That's a serious amount of stone. It rests on the tapering tips of slender upright stones in a way that makes it look like it's floating just above them, and that floating effect looks deliberate, not accidental. What survives today is a group of 7 principal stones sitting a few miles from Newport in Pembrokeshire, and moving even one of them without machinery would have taken serious planning and a lot of hands. Originally, the whole structure would have been buried under an earth and stone mound around 30 meters long, holding a communal burial chamber underneath. Here's the part I have to be straight about, because this is where legend creeps in, and locals later nicknamed it Arthur's Quoit, tying it to King Arthur, as though he'd tossed the capstone there himself. That name is folklore layered on centuries later. The tomb itself was already close to 1,000 years old by the time the first pyramid existed. If Arthur had been real, he'd have been visiting a monument as ancient to him as the Roman occupation of Britain is to us. This part of the story isn't finished yet. From Wales, the story jumps across the Irish Sea to a tomb that spent most of its life completely invisible, buried under a bog until the 1980s. In County Tyrone, Northern Ireland, sits one of the finest court tombs in Ireland, a style of monument named for the open, semicircular forecourt built into one end. Cregan dates to around 3,500 BC, and its cairn runs more than 18 meters long, tapering into 3 separate burial chambers behind that forecourt. Court tombs like this one were likely used again and again over generations, not for a single burial, with the forecourt acting as a gathering space for whatever ceremonies came before someone was finally laid inside. For most of its existence, almost nobody knew it was there. The site had been buried under deep peat for thousands of years, and it only came to light because land clearance work threatened to destroy it completely. Archaeologists excavated it between 1979 and 1982, and once the peat was stripped back, the tomb turned out to be in close to perfect condition, protected rather than damaged by centuries under the bog. Inside, they found cremated remains from 14 people in the chambers, with another 7 individuals cremated in the forecourt area, 21 people altogether. That's a lot of history in one small space. The landowner chose to preserve the tomb and open it to the public rather than finish the clearance that nearly erased it. By the time Egypt raised its first pyramid, Cregan had already stood for somewhere between 830 and 1,300 years, depending on which end of its dating range you use. And that's not even close to the oldest thing coming up on this list. What's next was already a forgotten ruin, buried and abandoned 1,000 years before Egypt existed at all. Pause here for a second, because the MH is about to change. Skara Brae, stones of Stenness, Pentre Ifan, and Cregan were all centuries older than the first pyramid, somewhere between roughly 400 and 1,300 years, depending on which site and which end of its dating range you pick. From this point on, the gaps stop being measured in centuries. What's coming next isn't just an old monument still standing on a hillside. These are places that were already abandoned, already buried, or built by people who had never farmed a single crop in their lives. Archaeologists split this stretch of time into distinct periods. First comes the Neolithic, when farming and monument building took hold, and before that the Mesolithic and the very tail end of the Paleolithic, when people still lived entirely by hunting and gathering. The next 4 entries move backward through all of it. The clock is about to jump by 1,000 years at a time, sometimes more. On the Ridgeway in Oxfordshire, close to the Offington Whitehorse, sits a long barrow that was actually built twice. The Ridgeway itself is one of Britain's oldest trackways, running along the same chalk ridge for thousands of years, so this tomb sat right beside a route people were already walking regularly. The first version was a timber burial chamber, put up somewhere between 3,590 BC and 3,555 BC. Then everything changed fast. In a surprisingly short window, maybe as little as 50 years, it was rebuilt entirely in stone, sometime around 3,460 BC to 3,400 BC. That's a switch from wood to stone that archaeologists rarely get to see documented this clearly at a single site. Excavations found 14 people buried in that first timber phase, 11 men, 2 women and a child, uncovered in 1963. A separate 1919 dig found 7 adults and a child jumbled together in the later stone chamber. These weren't just bones in the ground. Whoever these people were, they were buried on a hilltop that had already been a memorial site for more than a century before anyone touched the stone version. Whoever rebuilt it in stone was deliberately choosing to keep using ground their ancestors had already marked as sacred. The legend attached to this place is centuries younger than the tomb itself, and it deserves the same honesty. A Saxon charter from the year 955 calls it Welland's Smithy, naming it after Wayland, the Saxon god of metalworking. The story goes that if you left your horse there overnight with a few coins, it would be re-shod by morning. Nobody can verify a word of it. That's folklore, not documented history. It was already being told about a monument that was, to the Saxons themselves, unimaginably old, built and rebuilt by people whose names and language were long gone before the Saxons ever arrived in Britain. When the first pyramid finally went up, Wayland's Smithy had already been standing for around 900 years. From there, the trail leads back to Somerset, to the single most precisely dated object on this entire list. Most of the dates on this list come with a margin of error built in, a century here, a few hundred years there. The sweet track doesn't work that way. Tree ring analysis on its timbers pins construction down to the winter of 3807 BC to 3806 BC, or early spring of 3806 BC, with repair work continuing until around 3800 BC. That's about as close to an ECSAT date as prehistoric archaeology gets. The track ran nearly 1,800 metres across the boggy Somerset levels, linking what was then an island at Westay to higher ground at Shapwick. That's a distance of a little over a mile, through ground that would otherwise swallow anyone trying to cross it on foot. Builders drove crossed poles of ash, oak, and lime into the waterlogged peat to hold up a walkway of oak planks laid end to end. That means somebody planned this route, felled the right trees, and moved a serious amount of timber into a marsh on purpose. This took real planning. It was found in the 1970s by a peat cutter named Ray Sweet, working commercial peat extraction rather than an archaeological dig, and a donated section of the original timber now sits in the British Museum for anyone to go look at. One correction matters here. The Sweet Track held the title of oldest known trackway in the world until 2009, when a trackway dated to 4100 BC turned up near Belmarsh. So call it the oldest trackway proven this precisely in Britain, not an unbeaten world record. What makes the Sweet Track strange is how briefly it was used. Rising water swallowed it within about 10 years of construction, which means this walkway was already a buried, forgotten ruin more than 1,000 years before Egypt's first pyramid ever went up. From a bog in Somerset, the story jumps back again, this time into the tail end of the Ice Age itself. Creswell Crags is a limestone gorge on the border of Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire, and it holds Britain's only confirmed Ice Age cave art, only discovered in 2003. Before that discovery, Britain had nothing to compare to the famous painted caves of France and Spain, and archaeologists had generally assumed the people living here at the time simply weren't leaving that kind of art behind. The main period of activity here runs from roughly 14,000 to 12,000 years ago during a warm stretch called the Late Glacial Interstadial. Small groups of hunters followed reindeer and wild horse across tundra near the edge of the retreating ice sheet. That's a long, cold stretch of time. Inside the caves, with names like Robin Hood Cave and Church Hole, engravings and carved reliefs of deer, bison, and what may be a bird still mark the walls. Alongside them sit flint tools, worked bone and antler, and the bones of the animals these people hunted and ate. That's real art, made by real hands. This was the EGE of habitable Europe at the time, cold, exposed, and only survivable in short warm spells between glacial advances, with Britain still joined to the rest of the continent by dry land. Whoever carved those animals into the rock was doing something recognizably human, marking a cave wall with meaning. It shows these hunters were plugged into the same wider Ice Age culture that produced cave art across France and Spain, just working on a smaller, rougher scale, long before anyone anywhere had planted a field of wheat. When the climate turned cold again in a phase called the Younger Dryas, This gorge stopped being livable, and the people who once camped here moved on for good. By the time Djoser's pyramid existed, these caves had already sat empty as living sites for somewhere between 7,500 and 9,000 years. That's not a difference of centuries anymore. That's a difference so large it stops feeling like the same kind of history. One entry is left, and it pushes the timeline back even further than an Ice Age cave gallery. On the shore of a lake that no longer exists, in what's now North Yorkshire, sits the site archaeologists consider the single most important Mesolithic settlement in Britain. This is the big one. Saqqara was occupied around 9,000 to 8,500 BC, when Britain was still physically joined to mainland Europe, and the ice sheets were only just finishing their retreat. The climate was warming fast, with birch and pine forests spreading across land that had been frozen tundra not long before. The lake itself, Lake Flixton, vanished long ago, drained and filled in over thousands of years, but its shoreline once held a working settlement. No one in that settlement had ever seen a farmed field, a metal tool, or a written word, because none of that existed yet anywhere on Earth. Excavations here turned up Britain's oldest known structure, most likely a house, along with the earliest evidence of carpentry found anywhere in the archaeological record, worked wood that shows real skill and planning rather than crude hacking. Even stranger are the antler headdresses, made from the skull caps of red deer with the antlers still attached. The original digs in 1949 through 1951 found 21 of them, and later University of York excavations between 2013 and 2015 turned up another 12, bringing the total to 33. Nobody knows for certain what they were for. The leading ideas are ritual gear worn by a kind of shaman, or a disguise used for stalking deer during a hunt. That's interpretation, not settled fact, and it's worth holding on to the uncertainty rather than pretending anyone has it fully solved. Any number here matters more than any other. By the time Egypt's first pyramid existed, Saqqara had already been abandoned for somewhere between 6,300 and 6,800 years. Sit with that for a second. The entire span of recorded human history, every king, every war, every year from the pyramids to right now, fits inside the gap between the last person leaving that lakeside camp and the first stone being laid at Saqqara. Compared to Creswell Crags, the entry right before this one, Saqqara's people were still thousands of years closer to us than the Ice Age hunters were. That tells you how far back this list has actually gone by the final entry. People built homes, carved tools, and wore antlers on their heads by that water, and by the time anyone in Egypt dreamed up a pyramid, all of it was already ancient. Calling any of this older than the Pyramids almost undersells it. Some of these places make the pyramids look like recent construction, put up after the story had already been running for thousands of years. Tell me in the comments which entry actually stopped you. Britain and Ireland are full of places just as old as these, still sitting quietly in fields, hillsides, and bogs, waiting for someone to notice what is actually standing there.